Welcome to Passions Illustrated. Before starting the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. The sound of Isabella Martinez's heels echoed through the corridors of the Metropolitan Museum of Art as she made her way discreetly to the less visited wing of the museum. Her heart was racing not from the haste of her steps, but from the anticipation of the encounter that was about to take place. By the age of 25, Isabella had become a master of disguise, convincing her family that her frequent visits to the museum were motivated by her interest in art history, a perfect alibi for her secret meetings with Maxwell. In the medieval art section, among ancient tapestries and gleaming armor, Isabella adjusted the navy blue dress that hugged her figure. The engagement ring on her finger weighed like an anchor, constantly reminding her of her obligations to Richard Hawthorne, the man chosen by her family to perpetuate the Martinez financial empire. "You're looking particularly pensive today." Maxwell's familiar voice came from behind her, making her smile instantly. He had the gift of appearing silently, as if materializing from the shadows of the museum. Maxwell Anderson, as she knew him, was everything Richard wasn't: unpredictable, passionate, and free from the shackles of New York high society. At least that's what Isabella believed. What she didn't know was that every chance encounter had been meticulously planned, every word exchanged part of a larger strategy. "Just admiring how this tapestry tells a story of forbidden love," she replied, her fingers tracing the air next to the centuries-old fabric. "Sometimes I wonder if our lives aren't as intertwined as those threads." Maxwell approached, his discreet perfume mingling with the preserved air of the museum. His green eyes, which had so enchanted Isabella in recent months, carried a weight that she still couldn't decipher. As the secret heir to the Rochester fortune, one of Boston's most influential families, and historical rivals of the Martinez's, Maxwell carried the burden of a generational vendetta. "Every love story has its own challenges," he commented, his hand gently brushing hers. "But it's those challenges that make it all the more interesting, don't you think?" Isabella's cell phone vibrated in her purse, probably her mother, Victoria Martinez, wanting to know her whereabouts. Preparations for her wedding to Richard had intensified in recent weeks, and her family was increasingly vigilant. "We need to be careful," Isabella whispered, looking around. "Richard has been acting strangely lately. I think he suspects something." Maxwell smiled internally. Of course, Richard suspected. It was part of the plan. The Martinez and Rochester families had been rivals ever since a business dispute in the 1970s resulted in the Rochesters' near bankruptcy. Maxwell's father, William Rochester, had spent the last 30 years rebuilding the family empire in the shadows, preparing his son for the perfect moment to retaliate. "Maybe we should meet somewhere else," Maxwell suggested, guiding her to a nearby bench. "I know a discreet cafe in Brooklyn, away from the eyes of society." Isabella hesitated. Brooklyn was uncharted territory for her, raised in the exclusive circles of the Upper East Side. But the idea of a place where she could just be herself without the weight of the Martinez surname was tempting. "Tomorrow at 3, she agreed, her heart racing at the boldness of the decision. What Isabella didn't realize was that every step she took towards Maxwell was a step towards the Rochester family's meticulously devised plan. The cafe in Brooklyn was owned by an old Rochester ally, and every moment she spent there would be carefully documented. As they walked through the museum, Maxwell observed Isabella's delicate profile. His plan was working perfectly, but something unexpected had happened over the months. He had actually fallen in love with her. His true feelings now threatened to jeopardize years of preparation. "You know," Isabella said, pausing in front of a Renaissance painting, "sometimes I think about what it would be like if we had been born in another time and other circumstances." Maxwell felt his stomach contract. "Circumstances don't define who we are, Isabella. It's our choices that matter." But as he spoke those words, he knew that his own choices were about to change the fate of two of New York's most powerful families. Isabella's wedding to Richard Hawthorne was scheduled for 2 months from now, and Maxwell had until then to execute the plan that would destroy the Martinez's reputation or choose a different path. As they said goodbye, Isabella allowed herself a brief moment of closeness, her lips brushing lightly against Maxwell's. "See you tomorrow," she whispered, unaware that her every word was a note in a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Maxwell watched her go, his heart torn between family duty and a love that shouldn't exist. In his jacket pocket, his cell phone vibrated with a message from his father: "Don't forget the end goal." The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, casting dramatic shadows through the museum's windows. Maxwell stood there contemplating how his actions over the next few days could unite two families through love or destroy them completely through revenge. The choice, he realized, would be entirely his. The cafe in Brooklyn was exactly as Maxwell had described it: discreet and welcoming, with its exposed brick walls and plants hanging from the ceiling. Isabella arrived punctually at 3 o'clock, her heart racing with a sense of adventure and transgression. Dressed casually, something rare for her in jeans and a cream silk blouse, she tried to blend in with the local clientele. Maxwell was already waiting for her at a table at the back, partially hidden by an old bookcase. His warm smile masked the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming him internally. The night before, a heated argument with his father had made things even more complex. "The plan is at risk, Maxwell," William Rochester had said, his words laden with decades of bitterness. "Your hesitation is becoming obvious. Remember what the Martinez did to our family." Now, watching Isabella approach, Maxwell felt the weight of that conversation. She seemed lighter here, away from the pressures of Manhattan, as if Brooklyn were a parallel universe where their realities didn't exist. "This place is amazing," Isabella commented, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "So different from everything I know. Sometimes we need to get away from the familiar to see clearly." Maxwell replied, his words carrying a double meaning that only he understood. The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did between them. Isabella talked about her childhood, about how her mother Victoria had always controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the people she had relationships with. Maxwell absorbed every word, torn between his mission and his growing emotional involvement. "I got a message from Richard earlier today." Isabella mentioned, her expression darkening slightly. "He wants to bring the wedding forward." Maxwell felt his stomach turn. Bringing the wedding forward was not in the plans. "Why?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled. "He mentioned something about business opportunities in Europe. He wants us to move to London straight after the ceremony." Isabella ran her fingers over her coffee cup thoughtfully. "It's like my life is being decided by other people all the time." Just then, a customer accidentally dropped her handbag near their table, scattering its contents. Isabella instinctively bent down to help pick up the items. Maxwell recognized the woman. It was Claire Sullivan, an investigator hired by the Rochesters to document their meetings. His father didn't just trust him to carry out the plan. While Isabella was distracted, Maxwell discreetly gestured for Claire to move away. The situation was becoming dangerously complex. "You know," Isabella continued after returning to the table, "sometimes I think about just disappearing. Start a new life away from all these expectations." "And where would you go?" Maxwell asked, genuinely curious. "California, maybe. San Francisco. I've always dreamed of living there, opening my own art gallery." His eyes sparkled as he spoke of this long-held dream. "But they're just fantasies." Maxwell knew that San Francisco was exactly where the Rochesters kept their most profitable operations, information that would one day be crucial to his plan. But at that moment, all he could think about was how happy Isabella sounded talking about her dreams. Her cell phone rang, breaking the moment. It was Victoria Martinez. Isabella answered, her face instantly transforming into a mask of formality. "Yes, Mom. I'm in the middle of a meeting with the curator at MoMA. Yes, I'll be home for dinner with the Hawthorns." After hanging up, Isabella looked visibly upset. "I have to go. Richard and his parents will be home for dinner." Maxwell nodded, fighting the urge to reveal everything right then and there. Instead, he took her hand on the table. "Isabella, if you could freely choose your path without pressure or expectations, what would you choose?" She looked at him intensely, her fingers intertwined with his. "I would choose to be free. I would choose," she hesitated. "I would choose you." The weight of those words hit Maxwell like a physical blow. In his pocket, his phone vibrated with another message from his father, but for the first time since the plan began, he decided to ignore it. "Meet me tomorrow," he said suddenly. "There's a place I want to show you. Where? Trust me. I'll send you the address later." As he watched Isabella leave, Maxwell made a decision that would change the course of everything. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Claire Sullivan, operation temporarily suspended. Maintain absolute discretion. What Maxwell didn't know was that at that very moment Richard Hawthorne was receiving an envelope containing photos of all the encounters between him and Isabella at the museum. The coming storm would be much bigger than anyone could have predicted. Across town, William Rochester looked out over the view from his office on the 50th floor, a satisfied smile on his face as he read the message from his contact. Hawthorne has received the photos. Phase 1 complete. Richard Hawthorne's luxurious office on the 45th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper witnessed his silent fury as he spread the photographs out on his mahogany desk. Each image of Isabella and Maxwell in the museum was like a stab to his pride. His assistant watched nervously as he took a sip of whiskey, even though it was only 10 in the morning. Find out everything about this Maxwell Anderson. Richard ordered his controlled voice, masking an inner storm. I want every detail of his life over the last 2 decades. On the other side of town, Isabella was preparing to meet Maxwell at the mysterious address he had sent, an old warehouse converted into an art gallery in Chelsea. The space, known as the Warehouse Gallery, was famous for exhibiting emerging artists and avant-garde performances. I thought you'd appreciate something different, Maxwell greeted her at the entrance, noticing how out of place she looked in her designer dress among the exposed concrete walls and contemporary installations. Impressive, Isabella replied, her eyes taking in the unusual details of the space. But why here? Maxwell guided her through the exhibits, consciously avoiding the security cameras, a habit developed over years of training for the Rochester plant. Because this place represents artistic freedom, the courage to break conventions. Something you mentioned wanting yesterday. As they walked, Maxwell felt the weight of the cell phone in his pocket, now silenced after dozens of missed calls from his father. The decision to suspend the operation had caused chaos that he still had to deal with. There's something I need to tell you, Maxwell began, guiding her to a particular installation, a series of fragmented mirrors that reflected his images at multiple distorted angles. Before he could continue, Isabella's cell phone rang. Her expression changed dramatically when she saw the name on the display. It's Richard. The conversation that followed was tense, with Isabella answering monosyllabically as her face paled. Maxwell watched, feeling his elaborate house of cards begin to crumble. He knows, Isabella said after hanging up her hand, shaking. Richard has photos of us. Someone followed us, photographed us in the museum. The moment Maxwell had been dreading had arrived earlier than planned. The gears of the Rochester plan were in motion, regardless of his will now. Isabella listened. He tried to move closer, but she backed away. Did you know about this? Was this all planned? Her brown eyes, once full of admiration, now brimmed with suspicion. At that moment, William Rochester entered the gallery, his impeccable suit contrasting with the artistic atmosphere. I see that formal presentations will no longer be necessary, he said, his voice echoing through the empty space. Isabella looked confusedly between the two men, noticing for the first time the similarity in their features. Maxwell, Ms. Martinez, William continued, allow me to properly introduce my son, Maxwell Rochester. The sound of the surname hit Isabella like a slap. The Rochesters, the family her father had always mentioned as an example of greed and betrayal in business. Years of stories about how the Martinez had survived the Rochesters' attempts to ruin them echoed in her mind. All this time, she murmured, tears beginning to form. Was it all a lie? Not everything, Maxwell tried to explain, taking a step towards her. My feelings, William interrupted with a dry laugh. This was never about feelings, son. It was about justice, about taking back what was stolen from us. Isabella backed towards the exit, her mind processing the magnitude of the betrayal. The images reflected in the fragmented mirrors seemed to mock her, showing different versions of her naivety. The Martinez destroyed our family 30 years ago, William continued, implacable. Your father, Antonio Martinez, manipulated contracts, subverted laws, all to drive us out of business. Now it's our turn. Dad, enough, Maxwell tried to intervene, but the damage had already been done. You're just like my father always said, Isabella declared, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. Manipulative, vindictive. Isabella, please, Maxwell begged, let me explain. But she was already leaving, her footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. Maxwell tried to follow her, but his father grabbed him by the arm. "Let her go," William ordered. "She served her purpose." The photos are with Hawthorne. The merger between the Martinez and Hawthorne companies will be canceled, and our chance to take control is assured. Maxwell watched the one person he truly loved disappear through the gallery door, taking any hope of redemption with her. His fragmented reflection in the mirrors seemed to accuse him from every direction, each angle showing a different facet of his betrayal. What none of them knew was that Richard Hawthorne had secrets of his own, and the revelations of that day would only be the start of a much bigger storm that threatened to destroy not two, but three of New York's most powerful families. Isabella drove through the streets of Manhattan, with tears blurring her vision and her hands clenching the steering wheel of her Mercedes as if it were her only anchor to reality. The words Maxwell Rochester echoed in his mind like a cruel melody on loop. He stopped abruptly in front of the Plaza Hotel, deciding that he couldn't face his family at that moment. "Ms. Martinez, welcome again," the concierge greeted her discreetly, used to seeing members of high society seeking temporary refuge. In her hotel room, Isabella finally allowed the full magnitude of the situation to hit her. Every moment with Maxwell, every smile, every touch, every whispered word was now tainted by the shadow of manipulation. Her phone kept vibrating with messages from Richard, her mother, and of course Maxwell. Meanwhile, in the Rochester office, Maxwell was facing his own personal hell. "You're throwing away years of planning," William ranted, pacing back and forth. "Because of a teenage romance." "It's not a teenage romance," Maxwell retorted, his voice firm for the first time in front of his father. "And our revenge plan is based on a lie you've been building for decades." William stopped abruptly, his eyes sparking with anger. "A lie. Antonio Martinez destroyed our family." "No, Dad. I found out the truth." Maxwell pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "I've spent the last few months not only getting closer to Isabella, but investigating the past. The Rochester's collapse was the result of their own risky decisions on the market. The Martinez only refused a bailout that could have ruined them too." Across town, Richard Hawthorne was about to discover his own devastating truth. His private investigator had just delivered a full report on the Rochesters, including documents implicating Richard himself in money laundering schemes with Mexican cartels. "If that leaks," Richard muttered to himself, "it's all over." Isabella, still at the plaza, received an unexpected message from Claire Sullivan. "I need to tell you something important about Richard Hawthorne. Meet me at the Four Seasons in an hour." The decision to confide in a stranger seemed reckless, but Isabella had nothing left to lose. When she arrived in the lobby of the Four Seasons, she found not only Claire, but also a folder full of documents about Richard. "Why are you showing me this?" Isabella asked, leafing through the pages detailing her fiancé's criminal activities. "Because the game is bigger than Rochester versus Martinez," Claire explained. "Richard Hawthorne is using his marriage as a front for an international money laundering operation. The Rochesters found out about it and planned to use that information." Maxwell, who had traced Claire's phone, arrived at the Four Seasons in time to hear the revelation. "Isabella," he called softly, making her turn around. "Don't come any closer," she warned, but her voice betrayed more hurt than anger. "You need to know everything," Maxwell insisted. "Yes, I approached you initially because of my father's plan. But every moment we spent together, every conversation, every feeling we shared was real. How can I believe you now? Because I'm about to destroy everything my father has built over the last 30 years to prove it." Maxwell took out his phone and showed an email ready to be sent to the SEC with all the evidence of the Rochesters and Hawthorne's illegal activities. Isabella watched the screen, her world spinning even faster. "This will destroy your own family." "Sometimes you have to destroy something to build something new," Maxwell replied, his green eyes fixed on hers. "My father built an empire based on lies and revenge. I can't be a part of it anymore." At that moment, Richard Hawthorne burst into the lobby, followed by his security guards. "Isabella, get away from him now." "Or what, Richard?" she replied, a new strength in her voice. "Are you going to use your dirty cartel money to force me?" Richard's face paled. Maxwell positioned himself protectively between Isabella and Richard, while Claire discreetly filmed the whole scene with her cell phone. "It's over, Richard," Maxwell declared. "The evidence is already in the hands of the authorities." The ensuing chaos was swift and intense. Hotel security intervened. Richard was escorted out, and Isabella found herself alone with Maxwell, again, both of them processing the magnitude of the moment. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice only a whisper. "That's up to you," Maxwell replied, taking a step towards her. "I can spend the rest of my life trying to make up for my mistakes if you give me the chance." Isabella looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, symbolizing all the lies and expectations that had controlled her life. With a decisive movement, she removed it. "The truth is a good place to start," she said, meeting Maxwell's eyes. What neither of them knew was that William Rochester was already on the move to contain the damage, and that the coming storm would be even more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The real battle was just beginning. News of the scandal involving Richard Hawthorne and his connections to Mexican cartels exploded in the New York financial media like a cluster bomb. Isabella watched from the penthouse of the Plaza Hotel as the headlines multiplied on the screens of Times Square, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. "You need to see this," Maxwell said, entering the room after knocking softly. He carried his laptop open with a newly arrived email from William Rochester to all the board members of Rochester Industries. "How did you get in here?" Isabella asked, still keeping her distance. "Claire Sullivan has her methods," he replied, a tired smile on his face. "But that's not important right now. My father is calling an emergency board meeting. He's going to try to remove me from the company before I can expose everything." Isabella moved closer to read the email, smelling Maxwell's familiar scent, a detail that now made her wonder if even his choice of fragrance had been part of some elaborate plan. "Your father really isn't going to give up, is he?" she murmured, her eyes scanning the lines of the corporate statement that painted Maxwell as emotionally unstable and unsuitable for succession. "Not without a fight," Maxwell confirmed. "But I have something he doesn't expect." Just then, Isabella's cell phone rang. It was Victoria Martinez, her mother. After 3 ignored calls, she finally picked up, putting it on speaker. "Isabella Martinez, do you have any idea how much chaos is going on? The Hawthorns are threatening to sue our family for defamation." Victoria sounded hysterical. "Mom, Richard is involved with drug cartels. How can you still defend him? This is ridiculous. Richard has assured us that this is all a plot by the Rochesters too." "The Rochesters," Isabella interrupted, casting a meaningful glance at Maxwell. "What if I told you that I have evidence to show that the Rochesters aren't our real enemies?" Maxwell raised an eyebrow in surprise. Isabella gestured for him to wait. "What are you talking about?" Victoria asked, her voice suddenly cautious. "Meet me in Dad's office in an hour. Bring him too. There's something you need to see." After hanging up, Isabella turned to Maxwell. "You said there's something your father isn't expecting. Well, I have my surprises too." On the way to the Martinez building, Isabella revealed to Maxwell that she had found old documents in her father's office, correspondence between Antonio Martinez and William Rochester dating back 30 years, which told a very different story from the revenge narrative William had constructed. Antonio Martinez's office occupied the top floor of one of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings. When Isabella and Maxwell arrived, they found not only Victoria and Antonio, but also William Rochester, who had apparently been summoned to this unexpected meeting. "What kind of circus is this?" William shouted when he saw his son standing next to Isabella. "It's time for the truth, Dad," Maxwell replied, placing his own folder of documents on the mahogany table. "All the truths." Isabella took control of the situation, her voice firm, as she extracted the old letters from her bag. "Mr. Rochester, you have built an empire based on a lie. These letters show that my father tried to help your family 30 years ago by offering a merger that would save both companies." "That's absurd," William tried to interrupt, but Maxwell continued. "The merger was sabotaged, Dad. Not by Martinez, but by his own partner at the time, Theodore Hawthorne, Richard's father." The silence that followed was deafening. Antonio Martinez, who had remained silent until then, slowly stood up. "I've spent decades being painted as a villain in your story, William," he said softly. "All the while I kept my word never to reveal the true treachery that destroyed your family." Victoria Martinez seemed to be struggling for breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "All that time, all those fights, and now Richard is following in his father's footsteps," Maxwell added, presenting the evidence of the Hawthorns' criminal activities. He planned to use his marriage to Isabella to legitimize his illegal operations through the Martinez companies. Isabella watched the expressions of those present change as the truth unfolded. Her father seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. William Rochester was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the old correspondence. "What do we do now?" Victoria asked, her voice small in a large office. Maxwell looked at Isabella before replying. "We start again. No lies, no revenge. A real merger this time, based on trust and transparency." "What about Richard?" Antonio asked. "The authorities are already taking care of that," Isabella replied. "Claire Sullivan wasn't just a private investigator, she's been an undercover FBI agent for months." William Rochester finally found his voice. "Maxwell, son, I didn't know. All this time I thought." "Hatred blinds us, Dad," Maxwell replied softly. "But it's not too late to rebuild." Isabella watched as decades of bitterness began to dissipate in that room. There was still much to be resolved, many wounds to be healed, but for the first time in 30 years there was hope for reconciliation. Maxwell found his hand under the table, entwining his fingers with hers. This time there were no secrets between them, only the truth and the promise of a future they could build together. The Rochester Industries boardroom was buzzing with tension the next morning. William Rochester sat at the head of the oval table, his restless hands betraying his apparent control as the board members took their seats. Maxwell and Isabella watched discreetly from the adjoining room through the tinted glass. "They're all here," Maxwell whispered, recognizing the familiar faces of the executives who had blindly followed his father's orders for years, including Theodore Hawthorne. Theodore Hawthorne, Richard's father, had arrived earlier, his impeccable Italian suit contrasting with his troubled expression. The news about his son dominated all the financial channels, and the presence of FBI agents in the building's lobby indicated that the siege was closing in. "Are you ready?" Isabella asked, unconsciously adjusting the navy blazer she had chosen for that decisive morning. Her transformation from submissive heiress to a woman determined to expose the truth was complete. "I was born ready for this moment," Maxwell replied. "I just didn't know it would be like this." Claire Sullivan, now officially identified as an FBI special agent, joined them with an additional folder of documents. "We've just received confirmation Richard Hawthorne tried to leave the country last night. He was arrested in Teterboro trying to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands." The meeting began with William Rochester presenting his version of the facts, a carefully constructed narrative about corporate betrayal and the need for change in leadership. Theodore Hawthorne remained strangely silent, his eyes fixed on a distant point in the room. "That's our cue," Maxwell muttered, leading Isabella and Claire into the meeting room. The silence that followed their entrance was deafening. William Rochester stopped in mid-sentence, his face hardening at the sight of his son side by side with the Martinez heiress and a federal agent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," Maxwell began, his voice clear and firm. "You have been summoned today not only to discuss a change of leadership, but to testify to the truth about the last 30 years of lies." Isabella stepped forward, placing the old letters she had found on the table. These correspondences proved that the fall of the Rochesters was not caused by the Martinezes, but by a conspiracy orchestrated by Theodore Hawthorne. Theodore stood up abruptly, his chair creaking against the marble floor. "This is absurd, William. You won't allow your rebellious son and this Martinez to destroy everything we've built." "They built on lies," Claire intervened, handing out copies of bank documents. "The FBI has evidence of decades of fraud, market manipulation, and more recently international money laundering involving the Hawthornes." William Rochester seemed to have aged a decade in minutes. His eyes roved over the documents in front of him, recognizing his own signature on agreements that he now realized had been part of an elaborate betrayal. "Theodore," he muttered, "you assured me that the Martinez had sabotaged that merger." "You were weak, William," Theodore exploded, his veneer of sophistication crumbling. "You wanted a friendly merger when we could have taken everything, and now your idealistic son wants to repeat the same mistake." Maxwell approached the head of the table where his father sat in shock. "It's no mistake to seek the truth, Dad. It's not weakness to choose to do the right thing." Isabella watched the scene unfold, noticing how the council members whispered among themselves, processing the revelations. Years of blind loyalty were being questioned in the light of irrefutable evidence. "Mr. Hawthorne," Claire announced, signaling to two agents waiting outside, "you are in federal custody." As Theodore was escorted out, William Rochester finally found his voice. All this time, I've wasted decades feeding a hatred based on lies. There's still time to make things right, Maxwell said softly, sharing a meaningful look with Isabella. The Martinezes are willing to resume merger negotiations this time, with complete transparency. The board members, sensing the changing winds, began to voice their support for the new direction. The old guard that had sustained William Rochester's reign of revenge was being replaced by a vision of the future based on truth and collaboration. Isabella approached Maxwell, their hands meeting discreetly under the table. The touch was different now, no longer laden with secrets and guilt, but with promise and possibility. "What happens now?" one of the younger counselors asked, vocalizing the doubt that hung in the room. "Now," Maxwell replied, "we start to rebuild. Not just two companies, but two families." William Rochester stood up slowly, his shoulders visibly lighter, without the weight of 3 decades of bitterness. "Son," he said, his voice breaking, "you are stronger than I have ever been." As the meeting room gradually emptied, Isabella received a message from her father. "Victoria, and I want to have dinner with you tonight. All of us, including William. It's time to bury the past." Maxwell read the message, over his shoulder, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "I think we've finally found our happy ending." "No," Isabella corrected, entwining her fingers in his, "we've found our new beginning." The afternoon sun streamed through the skyscraper's windows, bathing the room in golden hues. Outside, Manhattan continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the profound transformation that had taken place on the 50th floor. Two business dynasties, so long defined by their antagonism, were about to write a new chapter, this time together. 2 weeks after the dramatic meeting at Rochester Industries, Isabella was adjusting the ribbon of a carefully wrapped gift in her office at MoMA. The box contained old photographs, images of her parents and the Rochesters in happier times before Theodore Hawthorne's lies poisoned decades of friendship. "I thought I'd find you here," Maxwell said, entering the office. His presence was different now, lighter, without the weight of the secrets he once carried. "The fusion dinner starts in 2 hours, and you're still working," Isabella smiled, noting the subtle transformation in Maxwell over the last few weeks. He had taken over as co-chairman of Rochester Industries alongside his father, implementing changes that went beyond the expectations of the financial market. "It's not work," she replied, showing him the photographs. "I found these in my grandfather's old office. Look, our parents at Harvard graduation, 1985. Maxwell examined the yellowed image, William Rochester and Antonio Martinez, young and smiling with no idea of what the future held. "It's amazing how one lie can change the course of so many lives." A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. Claire Sullivan entered, now wearing a formal FBI suit instead of the casual clothes of her covert identity. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I thought you might like to know. Richard Hawthorne has accepted a plea bargain with the prosecution. He will testify against his father in exchange for a reduced sentence." Isabella felt a strange mixture of pity and relief. Richard, who once represented everything she should have wanted, was now just a reminder of what her life could have been if she hadn't found the courage to follow her heart. "How is my father coping with all this?" Maxwell asked, referring to the radical transformation William Rochester was experiencing. "Surprisingly well," Claire replied. "He's spending hours with Antonio Martinez, rebuilding not only the business, but also the friendship that Theodore destroyed." Isabella's phone vibrated. It was Victoria Martinez, asking about the last details of the merger dinner. The event would be held in the Rainbow Room at the top of Rockefeller Center, symbolizing the new beginning of the two families. "Mom is still obsessing over every detail." Isabella laughed, showing Maxwell the message. "Some things never change. Some changes are for the better," Maxwell replied, gently pulling her into his arms. "Like us." Claire discreetly said goodbye, leaving the couple alone. Through the office window, Manhattan shone in the twilight, its lights beginning to dot the horizon like earthly stars. "You know what's funny?" Isabella said, adjusting Maxwell's tie, a gesture that was now natural, intimate. "When we met in that museum, you were playing a role, but somehow you found your true essence through that lie. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves to find ourselves," Maxwell replied, his fingers gently tracing her face. "Every lie I've told has brought me closer to the truth about who I really wanted to be." The sound of Manhattan outside created a familiar urban melody, distant horns, the murmur of traffic, the occasional siren. It was the music of a city that had witnessed countless stories of love, betrayal, and redemption. "We need to go," Isabella finally said, gathering her things. "I still have to change for dinner." On the way to Rockefeller Center, Maxwell took an unexpected detour, stopping the car in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. "Why are we here?" Isabella asked, although she already knew the answer in her heart. "Because this is where it all began," Maxwell replied, guiding her out of the car. "And this is where I want to start our next chapter." In the medieval art section, among the same tapestries that had witnessed their first encounters, Maxwell got down on one knee. The ring he held was not an ornate piece of jewelry, like the one Richard had given him, but a vintage piece that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who, as Isabella would later discover, had always believed in reconciliation between families. "Isabella Martinez," he began, his voice firm despite the emotion. "You taught me that true love is not built on lies, but on the courage to face the truth. You made me want to be a better person, not just for you, but for everyone around us. Will you marry me?" The tears streaming down Isabella's face were not of sadness or disappointment, as they had been so many times in recent months, but of pure joy. "Yes," she replied, her voice echoing softly through the empty gallery. "1,000 times yes." When they finally arrived at the Rainbow Room, they were greeted by knowing smiles from their parents. Somehow they had suspected that this moment would come tonight. William Rochester raised his glass, his voice carrying an emotion that few had witnessed before. To the union not just of two companies, but of two families. And to the love that, even through lies and time, has found its way to the truth. Antonio Martinez completed the toast. "And to our children who have taught us that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and that love is stronger than hate." Maxwell and Isabella shared a look that said more than words could express. Their love had been born of a lie, but had blossomed into truth. And now, under the twinkling lights of Manhattan, they were ready to write their own legacy, one based not on revenge or deception, but on honesty, forgiveness, and above all, true love.